Hi folks, we're going to wrap up this semester with a little bit of a closer look at some literature and art and architecture during the Renaissance. We've already talked a little bit about how we're seeing a shift from strictly religious themed art to more secular themed, non-religious based art. The same can be said of literature as well. Now, I've already mentioned Petrarch as someone that composed love poetry as well as revisited the works of ancient Roman writers like Cicero, or in the case of Dante Alighieri, who this painting is of here, his Divine Comedy was written in a local Latin dialect and was modeled on the popular poetry of many medieval troubadours. And for his Divine Comedy, this is definitely not dealing with religious subjects. So we're seeing that people are increasingly having an appetite for non-religious themed literature during this period. Just like us today, they just want to pick things up and be entertained by them, right? Escapism for a few hours. So a lot of this popular poetry, popular novels, plays that people are going to see during the Renaissance are increasingly stepping further and further away from strictly religious themes. And then, of course, if you want to understand a Renaissance writer who truly stepped away from religion, that would be Niccolo Machiavelli, who lived in Florence. He was a historian as well as a diplomat, and his writings became very popular, especially with the political rulers of the age. His were handbooks, or guidebooks, if you will, for those who wanted to seize political power. So your average person's not going to pick up a work by Machiavelli and find a whole lot to interest them there. But for those who were seeking public office and those who perhaps had some pretty formidable enemies to overcome or who needed to gain public support, Machiavelli was their man. He authored the work The Prince, published in 1532. It was actually published a few years after his death. But Machiavelli spent his life studying former political rulers. And essentially what he urged those who wanted to be in control to do is to not be honest with people. His was a belief that it was better for people to be afraid of you than to respect you and to necessarily trust you as being an honest individual. He urged rulers to do just about anything they possibly could to take power. The ends justifies the means. This is the first writer we see that really puts these ideas down on paper. And in doing so, he will completely divorce morality from politics. His is one of, don't let your conscience get to you. If you need to lie to people to get things done, then lie to those people. You can see I have an excerpt here from his most famous work, The Prince. And, he talks about in this first paragraph that, of course, being honest is a good thing and to be able to live without any scheming is good. However, he said, based on his study of history, many people who've achieved great things have cared very little about keeping their word and have known the skill of tricking the minds of men. And he goes on to say, of course, that if all men were good, this precept would not be good. But since men are evil, according to Machiavelli, and will not keep their word to you, you shouldn't keep yours to them. All right, so we often still use the adjective today. She or he is acting in a very Machiavellian way, and we mean that not necessarily as a compliment. We mean that they're taking Machiavelli's words to heart and that they are willing to lie, cheat, steal, deceive, do bad things sometimes just to achieve power. So to help understand how the works of Machiavelli or Dante or Petrarch became so popular, we need to understand a critically important technological invention that will take place in the 15th century. So when we think about how information was encapsulated and passed down from generation to generation, we go back to the work of the medieval monks. Who are writing by hand copies of the Bible or the Benedictine rule or what have you. We talked about this as being a very time-intensive process, and what it meant is that manuscripts were very hard to come by, and because of that, they were also quite expensive. What will be a complete game changer is the invention of the printing press. When we understand the first process of book making the way we understand it today, being able to print off multiple sheets of the same piece of text and then moving on and doing the next piece of text and printing 1,000 copies of that, this is where it begins with the invention of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, who lived in Mainz, Germany, was really the first to develop a form of movable type that could be arranged into these individual carved letters could be arranged into words. Those words could then be put into sentences and then into paragraphs. And that, being able to use a printing press where you put a fine layer of ink on that raised type, and then you imprint the paper on it, and then you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. This printing press process will dramatically speed up the production of books now. And because people are not having to do this by hand, they're not having to write out every single letter, every single word by hand, it will cut down the amount of time it takes to produce these books. It will also translate into cheaper copies of printed materials. The faster you can produce a product, the cheaper it can be, with the result being that now ordinary people who could never have hoped to afford a very expensive manuscript copy of the Bible, now, after the printing press, they can get one. They can afford one. And so what we're going to see is the printing press will start to make all sorts of materials, printed materials, etchings, engravings, as well, picture materials, available to a much wider audience in medieval Europe, and will at least partially be responsible for helping to instigate what will become known as the Protestant Reformation. Because as you might expect in Western Europe, the Bible was what most people wanted. And now that they had a copy of it in their own hands, and they were learning how to read, and the literacy rate starts to go up during this period, what it will mean for some people is that now that they can read the Bible for themselves, they will not be 100% dependent upon what the Roman Catholic Church tells them they need to do regarding their spirituality. Right, and speaking of going back to kind of to the arts, most of you probably have heard of Leonardo da Vinci, probably the most versatile of all Renaissance artists. He was truly a Renaissance man, someone that could do it all and do it all very, very well. He was a man of broad interest. He grew up in the countryside and carried a love of nature with him well into adulthood. He was fascinated, for example, with animals. He would dissect dead animals and kind of try to get to understanding the inner workings of them. In a little bit more grisly fashion, he also enjoyed dissecting human beings after they were dead, of course, but trying to find cadavers, dissecting them so that he could understand the musculature, he could understand the skeletal system, and all of this, not just because of his curiosity about biology, but to help make him a better artist. We often think of him in terms of the Mona Lisa, one of his most famous commissions, but in addition to that, he was interested in military weaponry and technology. He kept thousands of pages worth of detailed sketchings and drawings of various contraptions. Many people don't understand that he was an inventor as well. While many of his inventions stayed on the page, they were never actually translated into real contraptions like an early form of a helicopter. You can see it here in one of his drawing books. Things like helicopters, tanks, these sorts of things. He really envisioned these kinds of devices hundreds and hundreds of years before anyone really even thought about this sort of a thing, much less created it in reality. For artists like Da Vinci or Sandro Botticelli, Fra Angelico, and a number of the leading lights in the Renaissance, what we're going to see as well is, as I mentioned during the last lecture, we're seeing the technical expertise of these artists growing by leaps and bounds. You can see, for instance, I have here on the slide an 11th century painting, a medieval painting, and I don't know how well you can tell, but it looks kind of flat. There's not much dimension to this painting. You don't get a sense of depth of field, for instance. There's no shadowing. Everything just looks like it's on the same kind of flat plane, two-dimensional plane. Now contrast that However, with the Renaissance artist Raphael and his adoration of the Magi, you see shadows here, right, beneath this individual's feet. You see in the distance, right, you see objects become smaller the farther they get away with you. That's known as line of sight, right, or the horizon level. And all these things seem very obvious to us today, but for Renaissance artists, they are just developing these techniques to try and add more realistic characteristics to many of their paintings. So instead of looking kind of cartoonish and two-dimensional, many of these medieval artists, through the use of perspective, learning how to use shadows to create contours and depth, this is known as chiaroscuro, will start to add much more realism to these paintings. And the only way this can really happen is, again, if these folks can be doing their art 100% of the time, and if they have a big enough artistic community that they can trade in this information. They can teach newer artists some of the same techniques that have taken them sometimes decades to perfect. Another major artist of the Renaissance is, of course, Michelangelo. I'll give you more information on him in the next slide, but the Roman Catholic Church ended up being one of his strongest patrons or supporters during this period. Most of us are familiar with his work in decorating the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And again, notice the contouring, notice the depth of field, the use of shadowing to make these figures look much more realistic. And so Michelangelo, you'll notice a real human being, not a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. You've probably already figured out that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, their names, came from famous Renaissance painters and sculptors during the period. All right, so for Michelangelo, he is another of these Renaissance artists that was certainly very well-rounded. He could do it all and just knock it out of the ballpark. Probably an even better sculptor, for instance, than a painter. Just nothing that he could not do. He was also an architect. Many people don't realize that. He was a wordsmith. He was a poet. So we understand him as being really a giant in the field of the arts during this period. And I do want to say at least a little bit of a word about some changes in architecture as well. Medieval architecture tended to create a lot of tall spired buildings that are sort of reaching to the heavens. You see kind of this, what at Notre Dame in Paris, for example, you have what's known as the flying buttresses to support some of these very heavy stone load-bearing walls there. So you see kind of almost a filigree designs, a lot of emphasis on elaborate ornamentation, the use of gargoyles, that sort of a thing in medieval architecture. Now contrast that with Renaissance architects like Brunelleschi, for example, who created Il Duomo in Florence. You can see these sort of lower-lying structures. It, too, is a church, just like Notre Dame in Paris, but Il Duomo lies kind of lower to the ground. You can see the use of this beautiful rounded dome, the earthen colors of the terracotta tile here. Not quite as much emphasis on the elaborate carved stonework that you would see in medieval structures. So you're starting to see kind of a reflection of Renaissance humanism in the architecture of this era. Instead of it being kind of lofty, reaching towards the heavens from the Middle Ages, you're seeing this more human-like scale and structure, right, lower to the ground, something that feels a little bit more approachable from the human perspective. So some pretty fascinating changes in architecture during this period as well.